The woman looked at my engagement ring, stepped back as if she had seen something frightening, and asked a question that changed my life before I even had the chance to answer it. Her voice was quiet, but there was urgency behind it. While rain struck the bookstore windows and customers moved through the aisles around us, she kept her eyes fixed on the ring resting on my finger. She wanted to know whether the man I planned to marry was Adrian Walker. At that moment, I had no idea why a stranger cared about my fiancé. I only knew that the fear in her expression felt genuine, and that realization made my stomach tighten with unease. My name is Nina, and I was 18 years old when I learned that some people do not hide a secret from the world. Instead, they build their entire lives around it. 3 months before that rainy afternoon, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. I lived in a quiet coastal town with my father and stepmother, Selena. Our life was not perfect, but it was stable, and stability felt like a gift after the difficult years that followed my mother's death. Selena entered my life when I was 9 years old. She never tried to replace my mother, and perhaps that was why we became so close. She respected the memories I already had while creating new ones of her own. Over time, she became one of the people I trusted most. My father often joked that Selena worried enough for the entire family. Whenever I made an important decision, she encouraged me to slow down and examine every possibility before moving forward. At 18, I appreciated her advice, although I rarely followed it. Most afternoons, I worked at a small bookstore after finishing school. The work itself was simple, but I enjoyed the quiet atmosphere and the endless rows of books. Reading had always been my escape because stories offered something reality could not. They allowed me to experience different lives without leaving my town. Looking back now, I realize that books taught me many useful lessons. Unfortunately, they never taught me how to recognize someone who was carefully hiding the truth. I met Adrian during my final year of school. At first, he was simply another customer. He visited the bookstore several times each week and usually left with business magazines or novels. Unlike many customers who hurried through the aisles, Adrian enjoyed conversations. He asked questions about books. He recommended authors and remembered small details from previous discussions. Over time, those conversations became the highlight of my day. Adrian was older than me by several years, yet the difference never seemed uncomfortable. He carried himself with confidence and spoke about the future with certainty. Whenever I worried about university applications, career plans, or life after graduation, he somehow made everything feel less complicated. For someone who constantly questioned herself, his confidence felt reassuring. Many young people mistake confidence for reliability because both qualities create a sense of security. At the time, I believed that someone who appeared certain about everything must also be trustworthy. Life eventually taught me that those two qualities are not always connected. Several months after we met, Adrian asked me to dinner. A few weeks later, we started dating. The relationship developed quickly, but it never felt rushed. Adrian remembered important dates, supported my academic goals, and encouraged me whenever I doubted myself. When I received acceptance letters from 2 universities, he celebrated the news more enthusiastically than I did. Those moments mattered because they made him feel genuine. My father remained cautious, but even he admitted that Adrian seemed respectful and responsible. Selena liked him as well, although she occasionally asked questions that made him uncomfortable. Whenever she asked about his childhood, previous relationships, or family background, his answers often felt strangely brief. At the time, I assumed he was simply a private person. And now I know there is a difference between privacy and avoidance. After 8 months together, Adrian proposed. The proposal happened on a quiet evening near the harbor where we often walked after dinner. The sky was painted with shades of orange and gold, and the entire moment felt like something from a novel. I accepted without hesitation. For weeks afterward, happiness seemed to follow me everywhere. Wedding plans began almost immediately. Invitations were designed, venues were visited, and guest lists continued growing. Friends congratulated me. Neighbors offered advice. Even my father slowly began accepting the idea that his daughter would soon start a new chapter of her life. Yet beneath all that excitement, small details started bothering me. The first inconsistency appeared during a conversation about childhood memories. Adrian mentioned spending most of his early years in a city hundreds of miles away. The statement surprised me because several months earlier he had described growing up in a completely different town. When I questioned the difference, he laughed and dismissed it as a misunderstanding. The explanation seemed reasonable. Then another inconsistency appeared. A few weeks later, he described a former job in a way that contradicted an earlier story. Shortly after that, he forgot details from a conversation about his university years. None of those moments seemed important enough to create conflict. However, together they formed a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Trust rarely breaks because of one dramatic event. More often, it weakens through small contradictions that slowly accumulate over time. Each inconsistency may appear harmless on its own, but eventually they begin forming questions that demand answers. As the wedding approached, Adrian became noticeably distracted. Phone calls interrupted our dates more frequently. Planned evenings were canceled at the last minute. Some weekends disappeared entirely because of work obligations that appeared without warning. Whenever I expressed concern, he apologized and promised things would improve after the wedding. I wanted to believe him. Perhaps that was my biggest mistake. One Saturday afternoon, Selena accompanied me while I searched for decorations. During a quiet moment between stores, she asked whether I felt completely certain about my future. The question caught me by surprise because I had spent months convincing everyone else that I was certain. For the first time, I struggled to answer. That evening, Adrian canceled another dinner because of an unexpected business trip. Although he sounded sincere during the phone call, something about the conversation left me feeling unsettled. The next morning, I arrived at the bookstore earlier than usual. Rain covered the streets, and only a handful of customers appeared during the first hour. While organizing a shelf near the entrance, I noticed a woman entering the store. Her dark coat was soaked, and her expression suggested she had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time. At first, I assumed she was searching for a book. Then she noticed the engagement ring on my finger. The reaction was immediate. Had she stopped walking, stared at the ring, and looked as though the ground beneath her had suddenly shifted. A few moments later, she approached me and asked whether I was engaged to Adrian Walker. When I answered yes, tears appeared in her eyes. She remained silent for several seconds before delivering a sentence that instantly shattered the future I thought I was building. According to her, the man I planned to marry had proposed to her 2 years earlier under a completely different name. Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. For several moments, I could not process what the woman had said because her claim seemed impossible. The bookstore suddenly felt smaller, and the future I had been planning for months appeared far less certain than it had only minutes earlier. Although I wanted to dismiss her words as a misunderstanding, the emotion in her face suggested that she genuinely believed every word she was saying. After taking a slow breath, I asked her to explain everything from the beginning. She looked around the bookstore and suggested that we move somewhere more private because she did not want strangers overhearing such a personal conversation. Although caution told me to walk away, curiosity and growing concern convinced me to listen. We settled into a quiet reading area near the back of the store where customers rarely spent much time during the morning. Once we were seated, the woman introduced herself as Vanessa and carefully removed a photograph from her handbag. The image showed a smiling couple standing beside a lake during what appeared to be a vacation. The man in the photograph was Adrian. At least, he looked exactly like Adrian. His face, his smile, and even the way he stood were unmistakable. However, the name written on the back of the photograph was not Adrian Walker. The name was Daniel Mercer. Vanessa explained that she had met him nearly 3 years earlier while working in another city. According to her, Daniel had been charming, ambitious, and incredibly attentive during the early stages of their relationship. As she described him, I felt increasingly uncomfortable because she was describing the same qualities that had attracted me. Their relationship became serious, and eventually he proposed marriage. Vanessa admitted that she had been deeply in love with him and had already begun planning a future together. However, several months before their wedding, he disappeared without warning. She explained that his phone number stopped working, his apartment was suddenly empty, and every attempt to contact him failed. At first, she believed he had been involved in an accident or some kind of emergency. Only later did she begin suspecting that he had deliberately vanished. Several months ago, while searching online for any trace of him, she discovered an engagement announcement that included my photograph. The moment she saw Adrian's face, she recognized him immediately. Listening to her story felt like watching pieces of a puzzle slowly come together. The strange phone calls, the canceled plans, and the inconsistencies in his stories no longer seemed unrelated. Instead, they appeared connected by a truth I still could not fully see. Sometimes people avoid difficult questions because they fear what the answers might reveal. Looking back, I realized that I had spent months accepting explanations without examining them closely because I wanted my future to remain exactly as I imagined it. Vanessa was not trying to convince me to hate Adrian. In fact, she seemed more sad than angry. Before leaving the bookstore, she gave me her phone number and encouraged me to contact her if I wanted additional information. She also warned me that there were details she still did not completely understand. The rest of my shift passed slowly because my thoughts remained fixed on that conversation. By the time I arrived home, I knew I could not keep any of it to myself. When I shared everything with Selena, she listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions rather than rushing to conclusions. My father arrived home shortly afterward, and I repeated the entire story for him as well. Instead of appearing shocked, he looked troubled in a way that suggested he had been carrying concerns of his own. After a long silence, he admitted that Adrian had never fully earned his trust. My father explained that several details from Adrian's past had changed over time. Different conversations produced different versions of childhood memories, career history, and family background. Although none of those inconsistencies seemed important individually, together they created a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. As he spoke, and I realized that my father had been observing things I had chosen to overlook. Trust should grow stronger when people become more familiar with each other. When basic facts become more confusing over time, uncertainty often exists for a reason. The following afternoon, Adrian arrived at our house unexpectedly. The moment he entered the living room, he sensed the tension in the room and immediately asked whether something was wrong. I placed Vanessa's photograph on the table and watched his reaction carefully. For a brief moment, genuine panic crossed his face before he quickly attempted to regain control of the situation. He claimed that Daniel Mercer had been a nickname used years earlier and insisted that Vanessa misunderstood the nature of their relationship. Unfortunately for him, the explanation felt weak because it answered none of the important questions. As I continued asking about Vanessa, the engagement, and the contradictory stories he had shared throughout our relationship, his responses became increasingly defensive. Rather than offering clear explanations, he blamed confusion, stress, and misunderstandings. What disturbed me most was not his refusal to answer, but the fact that he seemed more concerned about protecting himself than helping me understand the truth. Eventually, he accused Vanessa of trying to sabotage our future and suggested that my family was encouraging unnecessary doubt. His frustration continued growing until he finally left the house without providing any meaningful answers. After the front door closed behind him, silence filled the room. For months, I had imagined marrying Adrian and building a life beside him. The possibility that everything might be based on lies hurt more than I expected, because I was not only questioning a relationship, I was grieving the future I had already started building in my mind. The following morning, Vanessa sent another message. This time, the message contained a phone number and a warning that immediately caught my attention. According to Vanessa, there was another woman who needed to speak with me, and her connection to Adrian was far more serious than anyone could imagine. Her name was Clara, and she was not a former coworker, a friend, or a casual acquaintance. She was another woman who had once planned to marry him. Vanessa's message stayed in my mind for the rest of the day because I could not stop thinking about what she had written. Until that moment, I had believed I was dealing with one hidden relationship and one false name. The possibility that another woman had once been engaged to Adrian suggested that the situation was far more complicated than I had imagined. I called Clara that evening, and after a brief conversation, we agreed to meet the following afternoon at a quiet cafe near the harbor. The hours leading up to that meeting felt unusually long because every new discovery seemed to replace one question with several more. When I arrived at the cafe, Clara was already waiting for me. She appeared to be in her late 20s, and there was a calmness about her that immediately stood out. Unlike Vanessa, whose pain was still visible whenever she spoke about the past, Clara seemed like someone who had already spent years processing what had happened. After introducing ourselves, she wasted very little time before explaining her connection to the man I knew as Adrian. 3 years earlier, she had been engaged to him. However, she had not known him as Adrian Walker. She had not known him as Daniel Mercer either. According to Clara, the man she planned to marry introduced himself as Ethan Brooks. As soon as I heard those words, a chill moved through my body because the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The man I loved was no longer hiding behind one false identity. He had apparently built several completely different lives. Clara explained that she met Ethan while working for a small marketing company in another state. Their relationship developed quickly, and within a year they were discussing marriage, future plans, and eventually buying a home together. Like Vanessa and me, she believed she had found someone dependable and committed. Everything changed when she discovered inconsistencies in his financial records. At first, the differences appeared minor, but the more she investigated, the more concerning the situation became. Eventually, she learned that several documents connected to him contained different names, different addresses, and conflicting personal histories. When she confronted him, he disappeared from her life within a matter of days. Listening to her story felt like looking into a possible version of my own future. That the similarities between our experiences were impossible to dismiss because the same pattern repeated itself again and again. He entered a woman's life, earned her trust, became deeply involved in her future, and then vanished whenever questions became too difficult to answer. People often assume that deception requires intelligence, but many successful lies depend on something much simpler. They depend on trust. Once trust exists, most people stop searching for reasons to doubt because they want the relationship to be real. After sharing her story, Clara opened a folder and handed me several documents. Unlike Vanessa, who only had personal evidence, Clara had spent years collecting information. The documents contained records connected to different names, addresses, business applications, and financial activities. Although the details varied, the photographs attached to several records confirmed they all referred to the same man. What shocked me most was the final document. Several months earlier, Adrian had submitted paperwork connected to a proposed business investment. Within those documents, he referenced financial resources that would become available after his marriage. Among those resources was property owned by my family. The moment I saw that information, everything became clear. The rushed engagement, the pressure to move forward quickly, the constant discussions about future investments. Even the urgency surrounding wedding plans suddenly looked different. For months, I believed we were building a shared future together. In reality, he appeared to be building a future for himself while treating my life as part of a larger strategy. The realization hurt more than I expected, because I was not mourning the loss of a relationship alone. I was mourning the future I had imagined, the memories I expected to create, and the person I believed I had fallen in love with. When I returned home, I showed every document to my father and Selena. As we reviewed the information together, the uncertainty that had dominated our lives for weeks finally began to disappear. The truth was painful, but it was also clear. 2 days later, Adrian contacted me and asked to meet. I agreed because I wanted closure, not reconciliation. We met in a public park during the afternoon. As soon as he arrived, he began defending himself and insisting that the documents were misleading, that he claimed that people were trying to destroy our relationship, and argued that every situation had a reasonable explanation. Months earlier, I might have believed him. At that point, I no longer could. Trust had been replaced by evidence, and evidence told a very different story. I listened respectfully until he finished speaking. Then I explained that the wedding was canceled and that my decision would not change. For the first time since I met him, he seemed genuinely unable to control the conversation. The confidence that had once impressed me slowly gave way to frustration because he realized there was nothing left to persuade me with. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt sadness, relief, and disappointment all at once. Ending the engagement was painful because I had loved the person I thought he was. However, remaining with him would have required ignoring everything I had learned. 3 weeks later, I should have been standing at the altar surrounded by family and friends. Instead, I was preparing for my final year of school and focusing on a future built on honesty rather than illusion. A year later, I could finally look back without regret. The groom's secret almost became my future, but discovering the truth gave me something far more valuable than a wedding. It gave me the freedom to make decisions based on reality, the confidence to trust my own judgment, and the wisdom to understand that genuine love never requires deception. My name is Nina, and losing the man I planned to marry was painful. Spending the rest of my life with someone who never truly existed would have been far worse. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more emotional English stories that help you improve your listening and vocabulary naturally.